feel like Monday morning came and I was like, what is this? How about you though? It didn't take. You got to do it.
Wasn't very long.
How you doing, Nick?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Sure, how are you?
How's your week so far?
Well, thank you.
I could drop so
Ready for spring.
Only Wednesday.
You
don't work on Saturday, do you?
Not usually.
2 more days.
I was like, everybody wants to give me.
They went to camp or whatever.
Love the weekends.
It's really hard because our bed's not really doing that great for us now. In the last
You need a new mattress kind of thing?
well, we bought a new one last fall.
Somebody said to me once, well, if you hate when there's so much,
Give it out and started to get.
I have tried
A
that.
new one
She and Michelle
not getting any sleep.
And those aren't cheap either.
No.
and then there's some other ones in the class that
In fact, in the first
Is it sleep number?
Is
Is it sleep number?
No, it's
Oh, I've seen them advertised.
yeah, it's one of the
You buy online and you open it up and it folds out.
it comes in a bowl about that big. And when you open it, it flattens out. It's like that big. And then you open the package and it goes,
Seriously?
yeah. It's that big.
Whoa,
They vacuum pack it that tight
Yeah.
and roll it out. And it comes in.
that's crazy.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. Shows up on your doorstep. They're heavy though.
Is it heavy?
They're heavy.
Okay.
Interesting.
I'm always afraid it would smack you as it unrolls or throw you across the room.
All right, good evening. Welcome.
I didn't know that. That's one of the twins?
Glad you're back for a Wednesday night. Thanks for being here. We are about halfway through the semester. So actually a little bit further than halfway through this semester. So we're making some progress here. So we're glad you're coming back every Wednesday night and thankful for the discussions and thankful for our Awana ministry and always good to get some time together on a Wednesday night. So we're glad you're here. Elizabeth, you're on crutches again? What happened, girl? Oh no.
Sure.
We'll lay hands on you when this is over, right? Maybe it'll work this time. Just look at your schedule, if you would, please, first for just a brief glimpse at that. Just want you to have on your radar that the week of Thanksgiving we are off. So we'll be meeting tonight and then 3 more Wednesdays and then Thanksgiving week is off. So now you can look forward to that and then 2 weeks and then we're off for 3 weeks over Christmas time. So just have that on your radar, but we'll keep meeting here for the next few weeks and take a break for Thanksgiving. So hello, Cheryl. Come on in. Good to see you. Hey, John. Come on in. Still rocking those shorts, huh? Sweet.
Yeah.
I wear my Chacos until the snow flies. It's my silent protest. Just don't want it
Why
to
not?
happen.
It's kind of chilly here. Can you throw another log on the fire?
Yeah, right. All right, you have a reading on your desk for next week. That's chapter 12, notes from the MacArthur Study Bible. So if you could look ahead in that for next week. I think we'll try and get done with chapter 11 today. We'll see how it goes. Cheryl's laughing up here because she knows that probably won't happen, but we're going to try our best to get through the rest of chapter 10 and all of chapter 11, and then we'll dive into chapter 12. So we're still on schedule. Talk about miracles. This is a miracle. We're mostly still on schedule. We'll see how long that lasts. All right, well, let me pray and then we'll begin. Lord, thanks for tonight. Thank you for the opportunity to gather together, and just thank you for each person that is here. Thank you for their willingness to come and be a part of this class, and thank you for the things that we're learning. Thank you for the hope that you're giving us through this wonderful book of Revelation, and we thank you that it tells us how everything ends, and we thank you, Lord, that you have the one that have ordained this, and you are bringing it to pass. So we're very thankful. Thank you that our confidence is not in the changing world around us, but it's in you who does not change. And so we come to praise you tonight for these things and commit our class to you now in your name. Amen. All right, so we are close to halfway through this book. We're getting close to the midpoint, and as you know, there's 22 chapters. So chapter 11 marks the halfway point. And just to kind of set the stage again where we're at, we are talking about this theme of how God wins and conquers and how God redeems this earth back for himself. So that's really the whole thrust of this book. So everything that we talk about up to this point, everything that we will keep talking about, just keeps intersecting with that theme, that God is in control, he's in charge, he's ordained the end, and he will take back the earth for himself. And I was just thinking this week that there may not be a more important topic than that. And I don't know about you, but we've talked about this before. You read the headlines and you see what's going on in the world, and you watch what's happening to marriage and families, and you're watching just the moral decay of our society from the top levels of our government down to every level of society. You see families falling apart. You see murder, you see violence, you see crime, you see even the effects of our own sin and broken relationships and hardships that we have with each other. What's our hope in the midst of that? I mean, this world is good. God created it good, so food is good and relationships are good and creation is beautiful, and we're about to see that white stuff start falling, unfortunately, and it's still pretty, and God has created everything good, and yet it's all tainted with sin. It's all laced with the fall. And everything, every part of creation, Romans 8 says, is affected by the fall and is groaning for the day when it's going to be redeemed. And so, where do you hang your hat when you see the consequences of sin? Where do you hang your hat when you feel the effects of the fall, when you see sin in your own life and you experience the effects of sin in relationships with people and you watch the world? Where is it you hang your hat? And I would argue that this book is where we need to hang our hat. And it's this theme of the kingdom of God and where it's going, and God's sovereignty and the return of Christ and him conquering and reclaiming this earth for himself. That's what our hope is. And so I hope what you're doing through this class is not just filling your mind with facts about Revelation so you can win some argument with someone when you're opening the book of Revelation. That would be the wrong approach to this book. There's a place for that probably, but really I hope what you're doing through this class is you're starting to be able to pin your hopes in some very practical areas of your life. When you're frustrated as a mom parenting your kids, or you're frustrated as a dad trying to shepherd your kids, or work is just, you're ready to retire and you're only 28 and and you're still looking at 40 years, and like, what gives you hope in the midst of that? Where do you turn when your best friend cuts you out of their life? Where do you turn when you have a falling out with someone who you're close with? I mean, this is real life. This is practical life. And if you're honest, every single one of us has to deal with this kind of stuff. And so what gives your heart hope in the midst of that? It's this. It's where this book is going. So I love this book. I love what we're working through. I love the nuances and the nitty-gritty and getting into some of the theological details. I love all that. But let's not forget the big picture either. Let's not forget where this is going and why we need this book. All right. So with that, let's go to chapter 10 again. We did not finish that last week. So we're still in the last week's notes, the angel and the little book of Revelation 10. We started getting our way through it. I think we got most of the way through it. But again, just look at page 1 of last week's notes. This is one of those interlude chapters again. So one of those chapters between the books, or the chapters that carry the chronology of the book. So chapter 6 has the seal judgments. Chapters 8 and 9 have the trumpet judgments. Chapter 15 and 16, mostly 16, but part of 15 have the bowl judgments. And so we're in those interlude chapters. Chapter 10 was the first interlude chapter. Chapter 7 was. Chapter 10 is the first section of the second interlude. And so we're getting some details that kind of fill in the gap for us. And so we meet this angel in chapter 10, verse 1. He is described for us. And verse 2 of chapter 10 says he has in his hand a little book which was open. And we talked about that open book, trying to figure out, is it the same scroll as what's in chapter 5, or is it a separate little book? We could debate that. But I want you to notice that down in verse, where is it? Verse 7 is really the key of this little chapter. It's a short chapter, but step down to verse 7, because there he kind of gives us the whole purpose of this chapter. So verse 7 says, "But in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound." So this is the seventh trumpet. We just finished the sixth trumpet, so we're almost to the seventh trumpet, which will come in chapter 11, but is not known until chapter 16. Chapter 10, end of verse 6, actually says that there will be delay no longer. Verse 7, "Then, but in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound, then the mystery of God is finished, as he preached to his servants and his prophets." So look at that little phrase at the end of verse 6. There will be delay no longer. And so if you're a believer in this age, what's your question? Your question is, when is this going to finish? When is this going to end? When is God going to bring in the kingdom? That's what you want to know if you're a believer in the tribulation age. And so here we get a little glimpse that there will come a point when the angel says there's no delay further, no further delay. And when he says that, verse 7 tells us that the mystery of God is going to be finished when that seventh angel sounds his trumpet. So what's contained within the seventh trumpet? Which judgments? The bowl judgments. So once that seventh trumpet sounds, we're getting really close to the end. The bowl judgments are about to happen, and we think those are right up against the return of Christ very, very soon after that. And so the kingdom is coming. In fact, I want you to notice, I'm on page 4 of the notes from last week. Towards the bottom it says, "When these mysteries, or these judgments, are complete, the mystery of God is finished." What is the mystery of God here? It's namely the establishment of his kingdom. That's what I was just talking about a few minutes ago, that this is all going to the establishment of God's kingdom, his literal earthly reign upon this earth. And so this is what was preached to his servants, the prophets. Look at the end of verse 7, says exactly that. That he, God, preached to his servants, the prophets, the coming of this mystery, the coming of this kingdom. So that's a reference to the establishment of the millennial kingdom. Now, when do we get this in Revelation? When do we get this? The millennial kingdom, chapter what? 20. Okay, so we're still a little ways from it, but chronologically we're getting closer as we're working our way through this book. And so here John says that at the end of verse 7 that this was what was preached to his servants, the prophets. In other words, this whole hope that we have, the whole coming kingdom, is something that was anticipated by the prophets, something that the Old Testament spoke about. I'm going to preach a message on Sunday about the Old Testament. So I'm going to go back and preach verse 4 of Romans chapter 15. I told you I think I was going to do that. So I'm going to do that this Sunday and go back and look at the profitability of the scriptures, which namely deal with the Old Testament. And here's an example of why the Old Testament is profitable, because the prophets told us what was going to happen when this mystery is unveiled, and it's the coming of the kingdom that's unveiled. So with that, what I put in the bottom of page 4 and the next few pages is an excursus on the Old Testament teaching about the kingdom. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go through this. I don't think we can really devote our whole night to this. So I kind of want to walk through it fairly quickly. But what I want you to do is I want you to see what the Old Testament said about this kingdom that we're still looking forward to. I want you to see it's not just a New Testament invention. And I want you to see that this kingdom is, number one, a literal, earthly, real kingdom that the prophets in the Old Testament had a lot to say about. All right, so I want to fill out that last phrase of verse 7 for you. As he preached to his servants, the prophets. What did he preach to his servants, the prophets? Well, I want to fill this out for you the next few pages. And like I said, I want to walk through it fairly quickly. And we'll probably come back and look at this as we get into chapter 20 as well. Any thoughts on that before we dive into that?
I wonder, the audience that these prophets were talking about, do you think they had any inkling of what they were talking about?
So like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel?
Yeah.
I think they did. I personally don't believe that we give the prophets enough credit. I think most of us think that they were kind of unaware of what they were writing about, kind of ignorant about what they were writing about, and really didn't understand it. I don't think that's the case at all. I think these were intelligent men, theologians, who had the Spirit of God helping them write exactly what they wrote. Now, did they understand all the implications of this coming kingdom? Did they understand when it was going to happen? Did they understand how it was going to happen? No, they didn't understand all those things, but I think they knew exactly what they were writing. I read a book, was it last summer? 2 summers ago, The Hermeneutics of the Biblical Writers by Abner Chow. And he makes a huge case, a very strong case, that the prophetic writers, the prophets in the Old Testament, knew exactly what they were writing about. They weren't bumbling idiots. And I'm not saying any of us are saying that, but I think sometimes we think they just kind of wrote and I have no idea what I'm writing about. Well, that doesn't make sense. If you write something, you know what you're writing. You don't write incoherently. At least most of us don't. You write knowing what you're writing. I think that's exactly the case with the prophetic writers. So in answer to your question, I think they knew exactly what they were writing. And I think they knew exactly the kingdom that they were anticipating. They knew exactly what it was going to be like. They knew the things that I'm going to walk through here in just a few minutes. So that's a great question, though, Ed. Go over to 1 Peter chapter 1, because I think that helps answer your question a little bit. So actually just back a few pages to 1 Peter chapter 1. Peter alludes to this fact here about what they knew. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10. Peter says, "As to this salvation, the prophets who prophesied of the grace that would come to you made careful search and inquiry." In other words, they studied what they were writing. They wanted to know about this salvation that was promised in the Old Testament. And here, look at verse 11, says, "Seeking to know what person or time the Spirit of Christ within them was indicating as he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the glories to follow." 2 things that they were trying to figure out. Who is it? And the timing. I think they understood almost everything else. I think they understood there was coming a Messiah. They understood he was going to usher in a kingdom. I think they even understood that he was going to suffer and die because of Isaiah 53. I think they understood those things. The things that they didn't know was, number one, who's he going to be? Like, who is he? They knew he was going to be a Messiah, but who is he? And number 2, when is it going to happen? Those were the 2 things that they were trying to figure out.
So they must have known that salvation would come through the Messiah.
Absolutely.
The sacrifices and everything weren't. But I don't know if all the priests, religious leaders knew that that's what the Messiah would do. I don't know.
Well, they were looking for the ruler Messiah. They're focusing on what we can see now with 2020 vision backwards. You know, he comes first and suffers, and then comes the second time victoriously.
But they didn't think first time he would come to suffer.
Yeah.
At least the unregenerate Jews didn't want that. As you're saying, they wanted a military ruler.
But the prophets might have known the difference.
I think the prophets knew. I think they knew.
That's kind of a hard one too, though. I mean, Isaiah maybe alluded to it, but you've got a coming kingdom, so you've got a coming king.
Right.
And that was the emphasis.
Yes.
My guess is that they would have expected the sacrifices and the temple worship and all of that to continue. They weren't looking for a replacement of all of that, even though the Lord promised a new covenant was going to be made.
Yeah.
It's a hard one.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to know all that they knew or didn't know, but I do think, I mean, if all you have is the Old Testament and get up to Isaiah 52 and 53, and he talks about a suffering servant, they have to know at some point there that servant is Christ or the Messiah, not Christ, but the Messiah, They know that, and they know he's going to suffer. So, but I think your point is well taken, John. Did they have a full-orbed understanding that Christ would die on a cross and raise from the dead the third day?
All the details.
I don't think they knew all that, but I think they did have a sense of a suffering Messiah. Yeah, Ashley.
Well, don't you think too, like, all the prophecies in the prophets about the millennial kingdom, they were thinking that was going to happen when the Messiah came?
Yes.
Right then? So, because that mean, doesn't it say in Jeremiah that there will be never be a Levitical priest
Yes.
to, like, or they'll never lack a Levitical priest to offer burnt sacrifices?
Yep.
So that's why they probably thought it was going to be on earth, is because all these prophecies about Jesus coming and establishing a kingdom that'll last forever.
Absolutely.
And it would have, if Israel had accepted their Messiah.
Exactly right. It would have.
It would have happened.
Had Israel received their Messiah in his first coming, the kingdom would have come immediately. That was exactly the fulfillment of all the things that I'm about to show you here in just a moment. That had they received their Messiah, had they accepted him as the one whom God sent to redeem them, the kingdom would have come. In fact, in Acts chapter 1, as they're about to watch him ascend back to heaven, what is the one question burning in their minds? Yeah. Is this the kingdom? Go there real quick. I know we're...
Is this it?
Yeah, go to Acts chapter 1. So this is Acts 1. This is after the whole life and ministry of Christ. This is after his death. This is after his resurrection. It's before his ascension. And look at verse 6. What is the one question they want to know? If you're a Jew, you've just seen your Messiah crucified and raised back to life, and he's still here. He hasn't ascended yet. What's the one question burning in your mind? It's in verse 6. Lord, is it at this time you're restoring the kingdom to Israel? Is this it? Okay, so it didn't go quite the way we planned. You were crucified, you died, you rose from the dead, but now is it coming? Now this kingdom that all the Old Testament prophesied about, now is it coming? And so I don't think we think about this kingdom theme enough. In fact, do you know we have a seminar coming up next weekend? I'll stop on that one, but you need to come to the seminar next weekend because it's the whole theme of that seminar. And I think you need to understand that theme because it really helps you understand both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So someone else have a question? Did you have a question?
I did, but I'm wondering why. I was thinking that, if the Jews would have accepted Christ at that time, what about the Gentiles? What about us?
It's a great question.
How would God's
They would have been
justice
grafted in.
What about
satisfy?
Paul preaching to?
Well, that's a great question. On one hand, you could say, well, maybe if Messiah had come and they would have accepted him, maybe the whole plan of the Gentiles would have been different than what it is. But on the other hand, you can say, no, it was God's plan from the beginning. What was the Abrahamic covenant? God says to Abraham, I'm going to bless all the nations through you. So Israel was supposed to be the conduit through which the gospel was to come to the nations.
They would have preached to us.
They would have preached to us. Yeah.
Probably the nation of Israel in that new kingdom would have been the evangelists to the Gentile world, just as it's happening in the millennium.
Exactly. Exactly. And we're going to look at this in a moment. But Israel is to be the gospel witness in the millennial kingdom.
That was their intended purpose back in the land in Canaan.
Exactly.
But how would they have preached the gospel of salvation?
Christ would have been their king.
Yeah, but
They've got the gospel.
God's justice has never been met.
Seems to be one person that causes
Oh.
Christ didn't die.
Well, but he's already died. That's what he's saying.
Yeah, I understand that part, but I mean,
If they had accepted him,
What we're
they
saying
wouldn't
is
have
this
crucified him.
kingdom had started after his death, at the time of
I thought
Pentecost.
it meant if they accepted him.
No, before.
But it is somewhat of a hypothetical question.
Right.
Because if they hadn't rejected him, He wouldn't have been killed, and if he wouldn't have been killed, he wouldn't have been our sacrificial atonement, and we would not have had a payment for sin. So you see this amazing paradox almost, that they should have accepted their Messiah because he was the promised one, and yet at the same time, if they did, he wouldn't have been sacrificed, and there would have been, that whole issue of sin still needed to be.
The gospel is.
Yeah.
Good thing it happened the way it did.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're kind of dealing with paradoxical situations or hypothetical situations, but as Susan says, we're glad it happened the way it did, because we're sitting here today as saved Gentiles because of that.
Isn't that what you preached on a little while ago about how Israel's unbelief, or was that Romans?
Romans 11.
Yeah. About how their unbelief is literally how we're, they were kind of what's the word I'm trying to think of? You know what I'm saying. Never mind.
Yeah. Their unbelief is our salvation.
Yes.
Yeah, their rejection is our salvation.
Yeah.
But the whole point of Romans 11 is he's not done with Israel.
Yeah.
He still has a plan for them. All right. So go to the bottom of page 4, because let me just rip through this fairly quickly. And again, we don't have a ton of time on this, but I want you to see what the Old Testament prophets said about this. And so I tried to kind of summarize this as quickly and succinctly as possible to help you see what the prophets were anticipating. So first of all, Israel is going to be the focus in this kingdom, and so the purpose of the millennial kingdom is to fulfill the covenant promises that God made with Abraham to his people, to Israel. So Israel is the focus, and this is why we're dispensational here at Maranatha Bible Church. It's why we're not covenantal, because we believe there's a future for Israel. Israel is the focus of the millennial kingdom. So our covenant friends, our covenant brothers and sisters, they don't see a future for the nation. And I think they're wrong. And I think that they're missing a whole part of the Old Testament promises to his people, that Israel is going to be the focus. So Jeremiah 31 says the Lord's going to make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. That's not the church. That's Israel. Israel means Israel. So Israel is going to be the focus of that. And there's coming a day, Jeremiah 33, when God will cause a righteous branch of David to spring forth, and that, of course, is in the nation of Israel. Go to the top of page 5. Also, Ezekiel 36, describing the new covenant, says that God's going to do this for his people. He's going to take them from the nations. He's going to sprinkle clean water on them. He's going to cleanse them from their filthiness. He's going to give them a new heart. He's going to put his spirit within them. He's going to remove the heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh, and he's going to be their God. That's a new covenant promise to the nation of Israel. Okay, that's not the church there. That's Israel. So we believe Israel has to be the focus of that in the millennial kingdom, because that's where those promises are going to be fulfilled. Added to that is the fact that Jerusalem is going to be the center for world worship, or the world center for worship. So Isaiah chapter 2 says the law will go forth from Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is going to be the focus of that. Micah 4 says that in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the people will stream to it. They're going to stream to Jerusalem. They're going to stream to Israel. The whole focus in the millennial kingdom is going to be the nation of Israel. It's where Christ is going to be. It's where the people are going to go to see Christ, and so Jerusalem is going to be the center. So Israel is the focus of the millennial kingdom. Secondly, Christ is going to rule and reign on the earth, and we believe he's going to rule and reign in Israel, in Jerusalem. And so when we say he's going to rule and reign on the earth, we mean that literally and physically, not metaphorically, like, again, our amillennial brothers and sisters do. They're saying he's ruling right now. We're in the millennium right now. They say we're in the kingdom age right now because Christ is on the throne of David in heaven and he's ruling over the hearts of his people. That's not what the prophets had in mind. Did it? I mean, think about that. Put yourself in the position of Isaiah, and he says, as we read every Christmas, a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace, and on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from than on and evermore. Now put yourself in Isaiah's shoes. Is in that moment, is Isaiah thinking, well, Christ is actually going to be in heaven and he's going to be ruling spiritually over the hearts of his people? How do we know that that's not what he meant? Because what did Isaiah think of when he was thinking a government and a throne and David? Jerusalem. A literal throne. He's thinking a real government. And so we believe that Christ is going to rule and reign on the earth. In fulfillment of 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God promised to David that he would have a son on his throne. Isaiah 24 says, the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. That's the literal promise. He's going to reign on the earth, on Mount Zion, in the city of Jerusalem. Micah 4, verse 7 says, the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion. So, this is what the Old Testament prophets anticipated. They were looking forward to a time when the Messiah would come in fulfillment of all the prophetic promises to rule as king over an earthly government. And under his kingship, Israel and Judah are going to be united. So here's this prophecy by Ezekiel. He says, for you, son of man, take for yourself one stick and write on it for Judah and for the sons of Israel, his companions, and then take another stick and write on it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel, his companions. Then join them for yourself one to another into one stick, that they may become one in your hand, and I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel. And one king will be king for all of them, and they will no longer be two nations and no longer divided into two kingdoms. That's a promise that Christ is going to gather his people, and he's going to rule over them, and he's going to do that as their rightful king. So he's going to be king over the Jews. Look at the bottom of page 5. He's also going to be king over the Gentiles, because in Psalm 2 it talks about the nations being given to him as an inheritance. That's not Israel, that's the Gentile kingdoms. The very ends of the earth will be your possession. So not only will he be king over Israel, he's going to be king over the Gentiles. Daniel chapter 2, top of page 6, speaks of this kingdom as well, the stone that struck all those other earthly kingdoms. Remember back in our study of Daniel, there were 4 kingdoms. Remember what they were? Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. Those 4 kingdoms are represented by that statue in Daniel 2, and the stone comes and destroys all those nations and establishes his own kingdom. And so that's illustrative of the fact that all those Gentile nations would be done away with. So he's going to reign over the Gentiles as well. It'll be a universal reign. Daniel 7 says, to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. Zechariah 14 says the Lord will be king over all the earth. So do you see what the prophets are saying? There's going to be a king who rules over Israel, and there's going to be a king who rules over the Gentiles. He's going to rule over the entire world. So they knew that this day was coming. And then just notice the time of blessing that the prophets anticipated. And I'm just going to rip through these fairly quickly, but there will be a time of physical blessing upon the earth when Christ returns. It hasn't happened yet. But just look at some of these promises that the prophets spoke of. They're going to, in Isaiah 2, turn their plows or their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. So there's going to be no more war. There's coming a day when Christ rules on the earth where there will be no more war. And we've not yet seen that day. Added to that, the curse on the ground will be removed. The land of Palestine will be fertile and productive. And just look at all these verses below this and all the blessings that are going to come on the produce and the crops and the livestock. And all of this is going to be evidence of God's goodness to his people. He's going to give rain. The bread's going to be plentiful. The livestock will graze in a roomy pasture. Oxen and donkeys will work the ground. The streams will be running with water. End of Isaiah 32, verse 15 says that the wilderness will become a fertile field, and the fertile field is considered as a forest. Isaiah 35 talks about the Arabah will rejoice and blossom. That's a wilderness. That's a desert. It's going to actually flourish and blossom. So deserts, in a sense, are going to be turned into these lush gardens. Isaiah 41 says, I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land fountains of water. Skip down to Ezekiel 36, verse 29 and 30. I will call for grain and multiply it. I will multiply the fruit of the tree and the produce of the field. Ezekiel 36, verse 35 says, this desolate land will become like the Garden of Eden. Now, our amillennial friends are going to read this and they're going to say, well, this is just metaphorical. It's just speaking about times of blessing upon the earth. And I would take issue with that and say, no, I think these are literal. There's going to be actual blessings on the crops and the people and the land and the produce and the water, and it's going to look like Eden in some sense, and there's going to be this very rich blessing upon the land. Top of page 7, some other things that this kingdom is going to be like the prophets anticipated. There will be sickness and death that will be greatly reduced. Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6 says, the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy, and the lame will leap like a deer. So sickness and death it's still going to be there to some degree, but it's going to be largely reduced. And so you're not going to have plagues and cancers that are just wiping people out like we see today. It's going to be largely reduced. Related to that, number 4, people will be healthy and live to an old age. Isaiah 65 says the youth will die at the age of 100. So there's still death in the millennial kingdom, but if you die at 100, you're considered a young person. Pretty amazing. So likely, people are going to live a long time, a couple 100 years, 300 years, maybe in the millennial kingdom. 400? I mean, how long did they live before the flood?
Pre-flood, yeah.
Just think about pre-flood age spans. I mean, Methuselah lived 969 years. And so I don't think it's going to be out of the question that people will live for centuries in the millennial kingdom. Because God's going to reverse some of that curse through his Messiah, his Son, being on the throne. Number 5, there will be peace among animals and with humans. The wolf will dwell with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the young goat. The calf will lie down with the young lion and the fatling. Isaiah 65 says the wolf and the lamb will graze together. So you can go hiking in Yellowstone and not fear the grizzly bears. I've gone there hiking a number of times, and just, you never know. You just always wonder. There's someone that gets mauled there every year, and so I've packed my 9mm. Wouldn't do anything to a grizzly bear, but I just felt safer with my 9mm at my side. I could, I don't know, make a lot of noise or something. Number 6, perfect justice will be executed. Isaiah spoke of a time when he will not judge by what his eyes see, nor make a decision by what his ears hear, but with the righteousness he will judge the poor. So perfect justice. Think about that. Perfect justice. Not a system that gets it wrong every once in a while, or not a system that's corrupt. It will be perfect justice because Christ will be the ultimate judge. This was anticipated by Isaiah. Jeremiah spoke of that as well. Number 7, there's going to be an outpouring of the Holy Spirit. God's going to pour out his Spirit on all mankind. Number 8, there's going to be a time of unprecedented prosperity for humanity, similar to what we just talked about in the previous section, but God's going to bless humanity. They're going to flourish, and they're going to enjoy life because the whole arena of creation is going to, in a sense, be undone from the effects of its fall. Not entirely, not until the new heavens and the new earth, but largely. In addition to that, there's going to be the temple worship and sacrifices. So Isaiah speaks of this, Jeremiah speaks of this, Zechariah speaks of this, and of course those 9 chapters in Ezekiel, 40 to 48, all speak of a time when there will be a resumption of the temple worship and sacrificial system. So go back to Revelation chapter 10 and verse 7, and all of that, and a whole lot more, but all of that is bound up in that little phrase at the end of verse 7, that this was what was preached to his servants, the prophets. So I hope what that does is I hope that just kind of opens your eyes a little bit to the incredible wonder of the Old Testament and what it spoke of about this kingdom. And most of what it spoke about pertaining to the kingdom hasn't come to pass yet. Lauren.
By them. But why is there a reinstitution of the sacrificial system? Doesn't really make sense to me.
Yep, good question. We're actually going to get into this in chapter 11. There's going to be a resumption of the sacrificial system, we believe, in the tribulation. There'll be a tribulation temple. And there will be a millennial temple as well. And most commentators of a dispensational ilk think it's a commemorative act. So Christ is going to be ruling and reigning on the earth at that time. They won't be sacrificing sacrifices for atonement because that's already been accomplished. So most of it will be probably a memorial, like our communion today is a memorial. Very similar. Rachel?
So just to clarify, all of these bullet 8 things you've listed off, those are all just taking place in the millennial kingdom, not the eternal kingdom?
Good question. I would say both and. Here's why. Go to your notes tonight.
Favorite answer.
Yeah, I'm punting. Go to your notes for tonight on page 7. And I want you to notice that little diagram I put at the top of page 7, that our understanding, a dispensational understanding of the age to come, has 2 phases to it. A millennial kingdom phase and the eternal state phase. And so we believe that much of the kingdom stuff that we just went through will take place in both phases, because it's the kingdom in its initial phase is the millennial kingdom, and its eternal phase is the eternal state. So a lot of it overlaps, but there is a difference between the millennial kingdom and the eternal state. So some of it is different. So a lot of it overlaps. I'm trying to explain this. A lot of it overlaps. Some of it's distinct. So let me give you an example. Go back to Isaiah 65 on page 7 of the notes for last week, which we just went through. So go back to page 7 there, Isaiah 65. Here's an example of a distinction between those 2 phases. No longer will there be an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not live out his days, for the youth will die at the age of 100. What phase of the coming kingdom can that only be in? The millennial kingdom. It can't be in the eternal state, obviously, because there's no death. So that would be one example, and there's a number of other examples like that. But that would be one example of how that in particular, that prophetic statement has to refer to the millennial kingdom because there's no death in the eternal state. So you have to kind of distinguish here what would be characteristic of the millennial kingdom that would be indicative of the eternal state not having been put in place yet, and what of those promises in the Old Testament would possibly be for both. And so you kind of have to be a sleuth and figure some of those out. There's a great little book, by the way, if you want to dive into this a little bit more, Dr. Matt Waymeyer's book, Amillennialism and the Age to Come. He deals with the issue of amillennialism, and he refutes it. And this is one of his refutations for the amillennial argument. Because amillennialism, this is kind of off track, but go back to the chart I just showed you in tonight's notes. Page 7 of tonight's notes. So this is our understanding of how the kingdom is going to come about, a millennial phase and an eternal state phase. Now, if you put your hand under that big line and you removed the 2 phases, that would be an amillennial understanding of the kingdom. So they would just say, well, we're living in this age now, and then Jesus is going to come back, and then we're going to be living in the age to come. And they're not going to see a millennial phase, and they're not going to see a millennial kingdom phase of the future kingdom. And so one of the problems with that position is the Isaiah 65 passage I just showed you. So if you're going to say, well, the Isaiah is speaking about the age to come, then how can you explain death? There's no way to explain death in the age to come if you don't have a millennial kingdom phase. That make sense?
That does make sense.
Marcy?
Then how would they explain all of these things that, like all these verses then?
Well, I think partly what they would do,
Well, I know that.
I think partly what they would do is they would say, well, this is indicative of the age to come, but they would also say it's also, much of this is fulfilled in the church today. And I think that's how they would,
No war?
I know. They would say that because Israel crucified their Messiah, all those promises are essentially not in existence anymore for Israel. The church takes over those promises. And so I think what they would do is they would spiritualize some of those promises and just say they're being fulfilled in the church. Dale?
They would probably think that we're in the millennial kingdom now.
Correct.
Because to them, 1,000 years is as a day, and a day is 1,000 years, so that's all symbolic.
Correct.
So we're in the millennial kingdom part now,
Correct.
and then
The other comes later.
Right.
I was wondering about the reinstitution of the sacrificial system and like the peace between like animal and human. Is that like not a contradiction, but a contradiction? You know what I'm saying? Like.
It's not, but it is.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, the problem I think would be more of animals are not going to destroy humans,
Okay, yeah.
not so much humans won't use animals in the sacrificial system.
Yeah.
They're getting gypped, man.
Yeah, they are. We'll have to wait till the eternal state for that to be all better. I think that's the issue.
Okay.
It's not that humans would stop using animals in the sacrificial system. It's just that you don't have to fear a great white shark when you're swimming in Florida. You don't have to fear a grizzly bear in Alaska. I mean, animals kill people. And I think that's what he's talking about in those Isaiah passages.
Go for a swim with a shark.
That's right. You can go for a swim with a shark if you want.
I don't know about that.
So, I don't know. Does this make sense to you? And do you see how the Old Testament really helps us understand what the kingdom? I mean, you can't get to Revelation 20 and just try to get your understanding of the 1,000-year kingdom from Revelation 20. Your understanding of the kingdom is going to be very shallow if you don't bring in all these Old Testament prophecies that really help fill it out for us. Thoughts on that? Questions? All right. Well, that was kind of a long detour. So let's try and finish chapter 10 real quick then. So verses 8 to 10 of Revelation chapter 10, we will just wrap this chapter up. It says, "In the voice which I heard from heaven," John speaking here, "I heard again speaking with me and saying, 'Go take the book which is open in the hand of the angel who stands on the sea and on the land.'" So remember, this chapter opens with a description of this strong angel. He's got a little book in his hand. It's open, and now the voice from heaven, presumably God, tells John to go to that angel and take the book out of his hand. And verse 9 says, "I went to the angel, telling him to give me the little book, and he said to me, 'Take it and eat it, and it will make your stomach bitter, but in your mouth it will be sweet as honey.' And," verse 10, "I took the little book out of the angel's hand, and I ate it, and it was in my mouth, sweet as honey, and when I had eaten it, my stomach was made bitter." What's going on here? What is this? Is this a statement that you should start munching on your pages of your ESV? Is that what this is? This is meant to communicate something to John. And go to the top of page 9 of your notes for tonight. "Though no interpretation of this event is given, it is clear what God's intentions are. John was to partake of the book's contents and appropriate all that was contained in it. And on the one hand, he was delighted. On the other hand, he was distressed." And so here's John. He's going to be somewhat of an illustration now of the things that he's experiencing and talking about and prophesying about. And so he's to eat this book. He's to ingest it. He's to, in a sense, appropriate to himself all that book contains. And that's partly, I said this last week, I think why that little book is maybe the scroll from chapter 5. May not be, but that scroll in chapter 5, remember, which Christ takes out of the hand of the one on the throne, Christ begins to undo those seals and comes out of that the judgments that we've been looking at for the last few weeks. So it's a book of judgment. And on the one hand, the angel says it's going to be bitter in your stomach. And on the other hand, it's going to be sweet as honey. So in what sense is knowing about the judgment of God bitter? And in the other sense, in what sense is it sweet? How would you answer that question?
It would be better because we're not heartless.
Okay, it would be bitter because we're not heartless.
It was painful for John.
Yep. How is it sweet?
Making everything right.
Coming back.
He's coming back. He's going to make everything right. He's going to vindicate his name. He's going to reclaim the earth for himself, and he's going to destroy his enemies. And so I think here John is kind of explaining for us a tension that we even live in today. That's why I kind of started tonight the way I started. On the one hand, we love life here. We love marriage, and we love family and kids and our church and food and bacon and, you knew that was coming. All those wonderful things that the Lord blesses us with, and a big bowl of mint chocolate chip ice cream and all those blessings that God has given us. We love those things.
Kosher bacon.
Is there such a thing as kosher bacon? Really? Turkey bacon? That's not even close. So on the one hand, we love what God has given us. We love the fact that we get to know Him. On the other hand, this world is tainted with sin and evil and wickedness, and we want God to judge it and vindicate His name. So this is the tension that we live in as believers. We want God to return to establish His kingdom. We want Him to return to vindicate His name, to glorify Himself. We want Him to return to put down His enemies. We want this world to be reclaimed for His glory and honor, and yet we know at the same time that in doing that, what's going to happen to all the wicked people? They're going to be destroyed, killed, judged, and eventually cast into the lake of fire for eternity. And that's a difficult place to be. And if you don't feel that tension, maybe you don't have a good awareness of both of those things. You want to feel that tension in your heart. On the one hand, you don't want to just not care and let the wickedness go. On the flip side of that, you don't want to be so heartless and cold that you want God to just destroy them and completely rain down His wickedness on them. You live between those tensions. I remember I was first here, it was almost 15 years ago now, and I prayed during the service something about, Lord Jesus, come back quickly. It's our name. It's Maranatha. That's what Maranatha means. Lord, come quickly. So I think I was praying something about that. Lord, send your Son. We want to see Him. We want to be in His presence. We pray for Him to return quickly. And then a woman came up to me afterwards and said, please don't pray that way anymore. It took me aback a little bit, and I thought, shouldn't we be praying for that and looking forward to that? And she said, I've still got family that don't know Christ. I don't want them to come back yet. I want them to be saved. I don't want them to have to face their judge. And so I think what she was articulating was that tension, that we feel both of those things. On the one hand, we want God's name to be vindicated, and we want Him to destroy His enemies. On the other hand, we know that the judgment of God is not something to trifle with. It's real people, real souls that will be condemned for eternity. So I think that's what's going on here at the end of this chapter. Look at the little quote I put there on page 9. All who love Jesus Christ can relate to John's ambivalence. Believers long for Christ to return in glory, for Satan to be destroyed, and the glorious kingdom of our Lord to be set up on the earth, in which he will rule in universal sovereignty and glory while establishing in the world righteousness, truth, and peace. But they, like Paul, mourn bitterly over the judgment of the ungodly. So I hope you feel that tension. I hope if your heart has swung one extreme or the other, that maybe you kind of bring it back to where it needs to be, that there ought to be a compassion for the lost, brokenheartedness for them. But at the same time, we don't want to compromise at all God's desire to vindicate his name. So, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, the lost isn't just people out there, so to speak. We all have friends and family that are lost. It hurts.
Yeah. I think it's easy to make this kind of a nameless, faceless kind of thing, and then you start thinking about the people in your life, your parents, or your kids, or your siblings, or someone like that, who now you're starting to put some faces with this, and it gets that much more close to home. And so we never want to get callous to those people. We should never want them to experience the judgment of God.
Because eternity is forever, forever, forever.
I mean, it seems like an understatement to say it that way, or obvious. Eternity is forever. But that's the point. It is forever. Forever and ever and ever. So
I don't like to see people suffer today with whatever. And then when we think of that.
yeah. So there's a bitterness and there's a sweetness to this. And I think that's a good way to approach the end times. Anytime you study the end times, you should have a bitterness in your heart towards God's judgment, because you know how deadly it's going to be. On the other hand, there's a sweetness to this. And so I guess the hope here is that we're not going to change the timeline, are we? We don't make this come faster or make it last longer. God knows exactly when this is going to happen, and the time will be right. So, all right, that's chapter 10. Questions? Well, that brings us to chapter 11. And we probably won't get all the way through, but let's see how far we can get tonight. On chapter 11, this is still a continuation of this parenthetical section. So kind of all of chapter 10 to 15 is a parenthesis, or it's this interlude, and so this is still that section. And this has been called one of the most difficult sections in Revelation to interpret, particularly the two witnesses, trying to figure out who they are, and a lot of numbers here. And again, I just put this quote here at the top of the page. We need to take these things literally. I think when it says that there's two witnesses, two people, they're two people. They're not two forces or ideas or whatever. They're two literal people. When it talks about a city of Jerusalem, which we'll see, it's a literal city. When it talks about 42 months in verse 2, it's literally 42 months. When it talks about 3.5 days in verse 9 and verse 11, we don't take that as indicative of 3.5 years. It's really 3.5 days. When we talk about an earthquake killing 7,000 people, it's literal. So, again, we're just kind of bringing back this principle of interpretation. How do we interpret this book? We try and take it literally as long as we can, unless the literal makes it impossible. So I think in this case, we're going to interpret all these things literally. So having said that, we come to these first two verses that kind of set the stage for us to deal with two people that we meet for the first time in verse 3, two witnesses. So there are a number of personalities in the book of Revelation you need to be aware of. Antichrist is one, 144,000 Jews are one, we've talked about them. And this would be another category of tribulation personalities that you just need to know about. So here's an entire half chapter on two witnesses. But before we get to that, we need to say that God always has a remnant. He always has a witness for himself. And that's what you see here in this chapter, that he will not leave himself without a witness. God always has a remnant, and he's always going to call his people to salvation by giving them a witness. That takes place in all periods of time. And if you're here today and you're a believer, most likely God sent someone to you. You likely came to Christ through the witness of someone that shared Christ with you. And that's what God does. He draws his people to himself on the testimony of witnesses. And so even in the tribulation age, even in the 7-year dark time on the earth, God is going to still send people to preach the gospel. We saw that with 144,000. We're going to see that now with another two people called the two witnesses. So before we do that, though, at the bottom of page 1, we need to talk about this little measuring thing that happens here. Look at verses 1 and 2. There was given me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, "Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it, and leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months." And so John's given this command to go take a measuring rod, literally a reed, probably this 15 to 20 foot long stick, like a bamboo kind of stick that was very common in that day. It was used for measuring, and he was to take some measurements of 3 things. Look at verse 1, says you're to measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. So that was the nature of his measurements: the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship in it. And he was to leave out the court, which is in the outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. Now, I believe this is a tribulation temple. I believe that there's going to literally be a tribulation temple, that there will be a temple erected during the tribulation age. So look at the bottom of page 1, because I listed 5 different temples mentioned in the scripture. So there is, of course, the first temple, which was Solomon's temple. You remember David wanted to build a temple, and God said, "No, but your son will." So Solomon built the great temple. The most wonderful, glorious temple of them all, probably at that point, was Solomon's temple. And then the people went into exile for their disobedience, and they spent 70 years in Babylon, and they came back under Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel had as part of his goal to rebuild the temple. And so that was temple number 2. So you have Zerubbabel's temple rebuilt after the exile, and the people come back. Well, then fast forward to the New Testament. You have Herod's temple. That was the temple that would have been around when Jesus was there in Jerusalem. And then number 5, we've already talked about the Millennial Temple, the temple that we believe will be reconstructed in the Millennial Kingdom. But there is another one, and it's the Tribulation Temple. And I think that's what's referred to here, that there will be a Tribulation Temple, an actual temple built where it was built in the previous 3 instances. Now, what makes that ironic? Because what's on that location right now today?
Dome of the Rock.
Dome of the Rock. What is the Dome of the Rock?
Islamic temple.
It's the Islamic mosque. It's the Islamic shrine, and I think it was built in the 700s, somewhere around there. So it's been around, for 1,300 years. And so presently on that location is the Islamic shrine, the Dome of the Rock. However, under the protection of Antichrist, the Jews will rebuild their temple. So think about this with me. What launches the tribulation age? Not the rapture. What is it that starts the tribulation age? Peace treaty, right? The government of Antichrist signs a covenant with the nation of Israel to do what for them? To protect them. Protect them.
Guarantee their peace.
Exactly, guarantees their peace. Look at Daniel 9:27. He will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. That week is 7 years in the context of Daniel. The Antichrist will make a covenant with them. He will promise to protect them. He will promise to guarantee their safety. So what you have for the first 3.5 years of the tribulation is relative peace between Israel and Antichrist. And I think in those 3.5 years, they're going to be able to rebuild their temple. Makes sense, right? He's going to protect them. He's going to supposedly be their friend. And I think he will allow them in those first 3.5 years to rebuild their temple. And so I think that's what you have referenced here, a reconstructed temple in the tribulation age, erected in the first half of the tribulation. What's he going to do at the midpoint of the tribulation? He's going to break his covenant. And he's going to cause the abomination of desolation. He's going to set up some image of an idol, maybe himself, in the temple. He's going to cause them to worship him. That's all those verses listed there are referring to. And so at the midpoint of the tribulation, he's going to break that covenant and will require the world to worship him. That is the abomination of desolation. So this temple, which he allowed them to erect, is actually going to become a place where he wants worship for himself. And so what is John doing here? Look at the middle of page 2. John's measurement was likely done to affirm his ownership, God's ownership, and to give assurance that God will take note of those who faithfully worship him during that time, promising to save and protect them. So John was to measure, remember the 3 things? The temple, the altar, and those who worship in it. So look down at the little diagrams I put at the bottom of the page there. He was to measure just the main temple complex. You can see the holy place and the most holy place. That's the actual temple. And then the court of the priest has the altar in it. He's to measure that and anyone who's inside that area. That narrow area he was to measure. He was not to measure, it says, the court which is outside the temple, which if you look at the left-hand diagram, you can see in really small words, the court of the Gentiles. That outer court, that section outside the main temple complex. He was not to measure that. And so, right above those 2 diagrams, I think this kind of captures it. Thus, John's measuring was meant to distinguish between God's favor on Israel, the section that was measured, and his wrath on the wicked nations on the earth, which was not measured. In other words, God's going to protect his people to some degree, and he's going to bring judgment upon the Gentile nations symbolized in this whole thing. All right? That make sense? Mm-hmm. Top of page 3. God will protect many Jews in a place he has prepared for them in the wilderness. Some people think this is Petra. Have you ever seen pictures of Petra in Jordan? The big mountain, not mountain, but complex tucked into the canyons back there. Many people think that perhaps that's where God's going to protect them. Revelation 12, which we'll look at next week, says that they fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared for God. So it's very likely that some of them are going to flee into the wilderness. God's going to protect them there. He's going to keep them safe. Matthew 24 speaks of this day when those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, probably for protection. And then, as a result, 2/3 of Israel will be killed in judgment, and the remaining 1/3 will be saved and enter the millennial kingdom. So Zechariah 13 talks about 2 parts will be cut off and perish, but 1/3 will be left. And so we think that this is about the time frame when that's going to happen. There's going to be 2/3 of Israel that will be destroyed towards the end of the tribulation age. 1/3 of those will be saved, perhaps the 1/3 that flees out into the wilderness and are protected and are then saved and then brought into the millennial kingdom. So the question is, how are these people going to get saved? And that comes to the 2 witnesses. All right, so that's kind of setting the whole stage here for verse 3 through 13. So yeah, Rachel.
I remember in class last year we went through it. Wasn't there another instance of the abomination of desolation in history?
Yeah. There's a historical event that took place about 200 BC when Antiochus Epiphanes.
That's what it was.
Yeah, he went into the temple and he sacrificed the pig, and he created that great sacrilege that launched the Maccabean revolt. That the people rose up and put him down. But that was the abomination of desolation. In a sense, that was a prefigurement of the one that will occur in the end times.
So it will happen again.
It will happen again. But it will happen again by the Antichrist and by his desire to be worshipped. Is that what you're referring to?
I think so, yeah.
Terry?
Up there in Revelation 6, when it says, then the woman fled, that's talking about the saved Jews or the...
Talking about the nation of Israel. The woman is a metaphor for Israel there. So all that to kind of set the stage for these two witnesses. So who are these? Who are these individuals? Look at verse 3, and we meet them here, and we find out a little bit about them. He says, I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. How long is 1,260 days?
3.5 years.
3.5 years. How long is 42 months? 3.5 years. Okay, so these are all the same time periods. 3.5 years is 42 months, is 1,260 days. That's all referring to the same length of time. So God says, I will grant authority to my two witnesses. Now, who are these people? Who do you think they are?
Moses and Elijah.
Moses and Elijah? Any other guesses? Enoch? Okay.
Elijah and someone.
Elijah and somebody? All good guesses. Here's the answer. We don't know for sure. How's that? I would probably lean to it being Moses and Elijah as well. But here's some other suggestions for these two individuals. Number one, some have suggested that this is Israel and the church. And again, it goes back to the comment I made about how we interpret this. These are two individuals. They're killed. They're raised back to life. It speaks of two people, not Israel and the church. So again, we're going back to our interpretive grid that we have to apply to interpret this section. So we're going to disregard that one. Some have said these are representatives of witness in the tribulation, just that there's this idea that God is going to have the gospel spread somehow, and there's going to be this concept of a witness within the tribulation. And this is just metaphorical of that. And again, it would go back to the whole, but it speaks of two individuals, and it seems like they're real people. And then some have suggested that this is Enoch and Elijah, and perhaps that's the case. Some suggest that because they did not die. They were really the only two people not to die, but to be translated to heaven. Most probably would think that these are Moses and Elijah for the reasons that I listed there. First of all, the judgments that come through them in the Old Testament are similar to the ones mentioned in verses 5 and 6. So you remember Moses brought in the plagues on the nation of Israel, and that's what's going to happen here. There's going to be water turned to blood, and there's fire, and Moses was the one responsible for a lot of that. Elijah was responsible for causing a drought. And so we're going to see that in those verses. So some similarities there. Also, the Jews in the Old Testament expected both Moses and Elijah to return. So Deuteronomy 18 speaks about the coming of a great prophet. And Elijah is spoken of in a sense of returning in Malachi. We believe John the Baptist was a partial fulfillment of that, but it could be a statement of the actual return of Elijah. Added to that, who were the two individuals in the Transfiguration? It was Moses and Elijah, right? So it's very possible that because that anticipates the second coming, that these are Moses and Elijah. And the length of the drought that is spoken of down in verses 5 and 6 is actually the same length as the drought that Elijah brought. He brought about a drought that lasted 3.5 years, which is the exact same length of this drought. You can see it down in verse, where is it? It's cut down later in the section, so we'll come back to that. But those are some suggestions as to why this may be Moses and Elijah. All right. Bottom line, we don't know for sure, and so we could probably just leave it there and assume that these are some form of witnesses in the kingdom, or in the tribulation rather, and they will be speaking the gospel and they will be preaching the gospel. We would think that most of these 3.5 years is the second half of the tribulation as opposed to the first half. So some have said, is this the first or the second half that this is referring to? It says in verse 2 that this will take place for 42 months, and so they say which section, which half, the first half or the second half of the tribulation. And for a number of reasons, we probably think it's the second half of the tribulation as opposed to the first half. But there's not agreement on that either. I would lean toward it being the second half when these witnesses will be prophesying for 42 months, 1,260 days. Okay. It says in verse 3 that they're clothed in sackcloth. This is the top of page 4 in your notes. Clothed in sackcloth. What's sackcloth indicative of? Mourning. So they're probably mourning over the fact that the temple has been, treated with sacrilege. They're probably mostly mourning because of the fact that God's judgment is about to come. All right, so verse 4 says, these are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. So they're called olive trees here. They're called lampstands here. This has a kind of a background in Zechariah 4. We don't have time to go through this, but I encourage you to maybe read Zechariah 4, and you can just see the imagery there as there's 2 olive trees that are described there, Joshua and Zerubbabel. Kind of an analogy there here as well, that these 2 witnesses are going to bring spiritual revival in Israel. In a sense, that's what happened under Zerubbabel and Joshua as well. Okay, verses 5 and 6, and this is where we want to spend a little bit of time. It says in verse 5, if anyone wants to harm them, fire flows out of their mouth and devours their enemies. So if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this way. Verse 6, these have the power to shut up the sky, so that the rain will not fall during the days of their prophesying, and they will have power over the waters to turn them into blood, and to strike the earth with every plague as often as they desire. Just incredible description of these 2 individuals. They have the ability to protect themselves supernaturally. In fact, if there's anyone who seeks to harm them or kill them, they have the ability to destroy them with fire. And so just a tremendous evidence of the fact that God is protecting this people, and he will enable them to destroy their enemies with fire. And I would believe that's literal fire. I don't think that's a metaphor for just something else. I think it's literal fire. God used fire to destroy his enemies in the Old Testament. Remember Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Levi? Is it Levi? Aaron, thank you. Aaron. Sons of Aaron, who were struck down and killed with fire. So I would say this is literal fire, and they have the ability to destroy anyone who wants to harm them. They also have the power to do supernatural miracles, similar to Moses and Elijah. We've talked about that just briefly. But they can turn water into blood. They will cause a drought. And think about what we talked about in the trumpet judgments. One of those trumpet judgments is going to bring about destruction of the fresh water source. And so now you've got these 2 witnesses with the ability to add additional drought to that, and that's going to make the world hate them even more. And so here they are, protected by God, preaching the gospel, proclaiming the good news of Christ, urging people to turn to him in the midst of all of this devastation and all of this judgment and all of this wickedness that's going on the earth as a result of God's punishment for evil. And so what's the world going to do to them? If they can, they're going to want to kill them. That's exactly what happens. Any thoughts on this so far? Yeah.
I've always leaned towards like Moses and Elijah being the 2 witnesses, but why do we think it's people who have lived before and not somebody like the prophet God raises up during the tribulation?
That's a good question.
It doesn't say it in the verse that they were from the past or anything.
You're exactly right. There's nothing that says it was someone from the past. In fact, you have an issue here. If Moses died once, and he comes at this time and he's killed again, that in a sense violates Hebrews 9:27, for it's appointed to a man to die once and face judgment. So that would be one of the arguments against this being Moses and Elijah, added to the fact that there's nothing in here that says it's someone from the past. So I think it's just the similarities that I read through that would make people think it could be perhaps Moses and Elijah coming back. But it may just be what you said. It could be just two Jewish saints in the tribulation who are unknown to us, who are saved, and God raises them up to be his witnesses. That could be just as likely as the other one.
They'd be dying twice too. So.
What?
They'd be dying twice too.
They'd be dying twice?
Well, if it was, oh, you're talking not in the past, but in the tribulation.
Yeah. But there was another person who died twice. Exactly.
There were a number of people were raised.
Well, even Elijah, the widow.
Exactly. So it's not uncommon. I mean, it's not common, but it's not unheard of that that would be the case. Yeah, Miriam.
Since this is a tribulation period, does that mean that the spiritual gifts of prophecy and speaking tongues and stuff are like in effect? Because I thought you said that like during the church age, then the spiritual gift of prophecy was no longer in effect. But.
Yeah, I think during the church age, those gifts have stopped, have ceased. But I would believe that in this time, the tribulation age, that prophecy will resume. And the question is, will it be prophetic prophecy, like them announcing things ahead of time, or will it be just the proclamation of truth? That's also prophecy. So prophecy has those two elements to it. And but I do think that there will be a return of some form of prophecy in the tribulation age. Joel chapter 2 says that will happen. They will prophesy again. So, yep.
Yeah, it is the end of the line, basically. So what else is? It's true.
Right.
It does say that. I think you had that one reference in here, the Joel verse.
The Joel 2? Yeah, Joel 2 says that men will dream dreams and young men will prophesy. And so, yeah, I would see that as a very likely reality in the tribulation age. So what happens to these individuals? Look at the bottom of page 4. They will be murdered. They will be killed. Look at verse 7 says, when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. What has to happen in order for that to take place? God has to remove his protecting influence over these two individuals. So up to this point, they're protected by the power of God. They're protected by his supernatural safety. But here's going to be the time when verse 7 says they have finished their testimony. So God's going to protect them all the way through until the point when they have finished their testimony. And the beast will come out of the abyss and will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the streets of the great city, which will mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also the Lord was crucified. Those from the peoples and the tribes and the tongues and the nations will look at their dead bodies for 3.5 days and will not permit their dead bodies to be laid in a tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and celebrate, and they will send gifts to one another because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. So a lot there, but who is the beast, first of all, that comes out of the abyss? Antichrist, yeah, it's Antichrist. This is the first reference to Antichrist in the book of Revelation. We're going to meet him a lot in chapter 13 and after that, but this is the first reference, I believe, to the beast in the book of Revelation. So as the Antichrist, he comes out of the abyss and he makes war with them. He kills them. He murders them. And notice where this is going to take place. Verse 8 says this takes place in the street of the great city, which is called Sodom and Egypt, where the Lord was crucified. It's very clear. We know exactly where this is going to take place. Not what street, but we know what city it's going to take place in. It's going to take place in Jerusalem. And he calls Jerusalem here Sodom and Egypt because those were places of great wickedness and apostasy. And Sodom, as you know, is a very wicked city. And those places were known for rejecting God, which tells you something about Jerusalem in that day. It's not going to be a place that's friendly to believers. It's going to be a place of great apostasy, great wickedness, great immorality, and that's where they will be murdered. And for 3.5 days, their bodies will lie in the streets. In fact, they will actually physically prevent them from being buried. Why?
Because they're celebrating?
Because they're celebrating. This is just to heighten the contempt for these individuals. This is just showing how much disdain they have for them. In fact, the Old Testament required that the body be buried on the same day that they died on. Deuteronomy 21 requires that. And so here they're actually not allowing that to take place. They're trying to foster this disdain for these two individuals. And it's interesting here that it says all of the earth is going to see this. So look at verse 9. It says the peoples and the tribes and the tongues and the nations will look at their dead bodies for 3.5 days. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and celebrate. So somehow the whole earth is going to see this. And we live in a day where that's not that difficult to imagine. Right? I mean, there's cams all over the place. There's streaming stuff on the internet. You can hop on and you can watch things all around the world just by sitting on your computer. And so this is not that difficult to imagine, that the world's going to watch and they're going to see, and there's a picture down there, just a depiction, but the world's going to see 2 dead bodies on the streets of Jerusalem. And they're going to see it. And people are likely going to be glued to their TVs or their cell phones or whatever technology is going to be in place at that point. And they're going to see this. And they're going to see the people partying. And that's what verse 10? That's what verse 10 says. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and celebrate, and they will send gifts to one another. I mean, this is they're making a holiday out of this. This is a celebration that the world is clapping their hands and applauding, and they're sending gifts, and this is one big, massive celebration. This is the depravity of that day. That 2 people whom God has sent to preach His message are actually killed and the whole world rejoices. In fact, this is the only place where it says that there's any kind of rejoicing in the tribulation. And why are they rejoicing? Because God's servants are killed. So that just shows you the level of depravity that's going on at this point. They are celebrating the death of God's true messengers. And just a point of application right above the little picture there, this is a reminder that those who speak God's truth are always a torment to a wicked world because they pose an obstacle to wickedness. Don't we see that today? Mm-hmm. Isn't anyone who stands up and says, "Thus says the Lord," to the world and calls out people's darkness and sin, what does the world do to that person? They hate him or her. And they try to silence you. And I mean, we live in a country where that's happening, where people who stand up for traditional values in marriage are being silenced, and Chick-fil-A is being, banned on campuses and protested and those kinds of things because of what they stand for. And so this is the world that we live in today. So again, it's not hard to imagine that this day is going to happen when almost the entire world is going to rise up and celebrate their death. So I think we'll stop here. Yeah, Terry.
think life during the tribulation period will be like life today as far as day-to-day activity? Because I mean, with all the cataclysmic events that have been happening before this, it's just hard to imagine the world the same as it is.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's going to be the same world. It's going to be the same countries, the same nations. I mean, in a sense, it's going to be life as we know it. But as you stated, there's going to be cataclysmic devastation that we've never seen before. And so life as we know it, in another sense, is going to be completely different. It's going to be harder to get food. It's going to be harder to get water. There's going to be great devastation over all the earth. There's going to be scorched area. I mean, so there's a level of devastation that we really can't fathom.
When it mentions about exchanging of the gifts and this and that, you wonder, well, what's left to give to everybody?
Good point. Good point.
Of course, the criminals and the bad people are just in the head.
Right.
I just, for some reason, Revelation just can't life being.
Yeah. Well said. Rachel?
It's just interesting, like I kind of see a parallel to Christ, because it's like when the witnesses come on the scene, like they have, it says that if anyone wants to harm them, fire flows out of their mouth and devours their enemies. Like they have that power to just strike them dead, just like Jesus had the power to do the same, and he was healing people and like he was God in the flesh, but then all of a sudden he like gives up that right, and he gives up this power just like these witnesses. Because it's interesting, like they were killed, but it's like, and when they first come on the scene, it's like they're the ones who are striking people down
Exactly.
and they try to come at them. So it's almost like they're just there for a purpose, and
Yep.
then their purpose is met, and they relinquish their power.
Exactly.
I just think it's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think this takes us right up to the return of Christ. So I think their death and resurrection is just a few days before the return of Christ. So, because remember it says that they do this for 1,260 days. So anyway, we'll pick it up there next week. So read chapter 12 and talk more next week. Thank you.
I know.